All right, welcome back to Wildlife Cake and Cocktails, everybody. Episode 22 here. Now, we've got a very special show for you guys today. In fact, this is the first in our series of TSR Hub Book of Hope podcasts. Now, here at Wildlife Cake and Cocktails, we know that there can be a certain amount of doom and gloom in threatened species conservation, particularly here in Australia with 1,800 species listed as threatened, huge deforestation rates, invasive species, and many other threats. Luckily, a new national review of successful conservation projects coordinated by the Threatened Species Recovery Hub of the National Environmental Science Program is drawing attention to the fact that with adequate leadership, support and commitment, all types of Australian threatened species can be successfully recovered. The results and stories behind this national review have just been published in Recovering Australian Threatened Species, a Book of Hope, available from CSIRO Publishing. Now, in fields so often dominated by bad news, lost species, and incredible challenges, this book highlights some of the recent hard-fought victories in Australian wildlife conservation. In this episode, we're going to be talking to the lead editor of the books. That's Professor Stephen Garnett from the Charles Darwin University. So we're very excited to bring you this, the first in a series of shows looking at these wildlife success stories, and keep an eye out for future specials, future special episodes featuring case studies of these successes in conserving threatened fish, birds, mammals, reptiles, plants, and much more. And of course, you can go check out the book at CSIRO Publishing. Now, of course, in honor of all the fantastic work being done to recover these threatened species and for the threatened species themselves, struggling on, I'm drinking something called a Will to Live, to celebrate their will to live. It's got Cointreau, amaretto, cognac, and ice cream. It's kind of like a really alcoholic milkshake. And I've also got some fresh cream mudcake, which you have to have for any kind of celebration, of course. Now, our main guest onto the show will be Professor Stephen Garnett. After a Bachelor of Science with Honours in Zoology from Australian National Uni in 1977, he moved up to James Cook Uni for a PhD in Zoology and Tropical Veterinary Science in 1984 on nutrition and farm husbandry in green turtles and estuarine crocodiles. Since then, he spent over 30 years involved in a broad range of conservation research and management roles with a variety of cool species, including golden-shouldered parrots, kangaroo island, glossy black cockatoos, and much, much more. He's currently Professor of Conservation and Livelihoods at Charles Darwin Uni and Deputy Director of the Threatened Species Recovery Hub. So here to tell us more about Recovering Australian Threatened Species, a Book of Hope, recently published just this March by CSIRO. Professor Stephen Garnett is the lead editor, along with Peter Latch, David Lindenmeyer, and John Wojnarski. Professor Garnett, thank you so much for joining us, mate.
My pleasure.
Excellent. It was great to have you on, especially after we had a few missed opportunities there with the shutdown from Cyclone Marcus.
That's right. Yes, so we've got over that now. It's blown past.
Yeah, and the university's back open again, so we can get on with the show. We had Cyclone Linda here, being cyclone season, of course, here in tropical Australia. But luckily, it just kind of cruised along the coastline and made a bit of waves for all the surfers along the coast here. All right, look, so on to the show. The Book of Hope. Very, very excited to hear about this. Now, from what I understand, there's some 30 case studies involving these successfully recovered threatened species. Now, that's a huge amount of experts and researchers and land managers, all that had to be brought together. How did you manage to get all these people involved, and how exactly did this book come about?
Well, its origin probably goes back nearly 10 years now, when we started thinking about the messaging around threatened species and how gloomy it all was and how hopeless. And you look at the changes that have occurred over the last 50 years in the environment and environmental management, there's been a lot of good things as well as the bad things. And if you don't tell stories about the good things, people will give up.
Right.
To tackle threatened species, you've got to be optimistic, really, or you don't even start. And there's plenty of room for optimism. So David Lindenmayer and I wrote something about that, and we're still getting comments on that many years later. And taking that message forward, we decided as part of this project that we should bring together successful managers of threatened species from around the country in a workshop, which we did a couple of years ago. Lots of enthusiasm about it, lots of people wanting to come to it, to tell these good stories about the things they've been doing, because many of these people have given their lives to the threatened species they're working on, and they rarely get the credit for the work they've done. So we brought them together in a workshop, we got people to tell the stories and tried to then tease out the common factors behind their successes.
Okay, so how long ago exactly was the workshop that got everybody together?
So that was March 2016.
Oh, so quite recently.
Oh yes. It takes a while to get everybody to write their chapters and take it through to production. But these are pretty up to date. These stories. You always got to be careful that something doesn't take a downturn between when the work is the workshop and when it's published, but to the best of my knowledge, everything with these has continued to go well.
Oh, fantastic. Well, yeah, obviously that's what we hope for with all of these projects, I guess. So look, can you tell us, what exactly is the book about, and why do you think it's necessary now?
I think it's necessary now because it's necessary any time to tell these stories. There is a hope from the Australian public we won't lose more species to extinction. We get that again and again with our surveys. What we need to do is demonstrate that we can bring things back, even things we think we've lost a century ago. They're rediscovered and we can bring them back to some level of security where extinction is less likely. And that's a story that needs to be told to those funding threatened species work, to say that the money's worth spending, that it's not just throwing it at things that are going to go anyway. Yeah.
Well, look, even as a youngster, I remember how inspired I was by the rediscovery of the Pygmy Blue Tom. The little Tiliqua adelaidensis, that was thought completely extinct and gone for quite some time, and then I believe it was rediscovered after a herpetologist accidentally hit a snake on the road and looked inside its stomach contents. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes, there's a number of stories in this book that I like that, of things that have disappeared and then been brought back to life again in some ways. So the book it's got a brief introduction from us about what we're trying to do, and then it has about 30 chapters from people from all over the country who have been involved in threatened species recovery, often some of them for over 50 years, bringing these species back and telling those stories. And then we have a chapter at the end that's talking about what the common threads are.
Yeah, right. So as I understand it as well, it's not just single species case studies. There's like a broad variety of, well, first of all, you're looking at broad taxonomic groups. There's things from invertebrates through to plants, through to mammals, through to obviously reptiles, as we mentioned. On top of that, it's not just species that were thought extinct, but things that were known to be in decline, where the decline was reversed and things of this nature. So it's quite a broad, not only taxonomic range, but, I guess what you define as a successful recovery. There's a broad number of different, I guess, successful cases in a broad number of categories as well.
That's right, yes. We start with the Humpback Whale, which is come back because of successful policy change in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, right.
And then we have invertebrates, as you say, fish, plants. The start of the book is all about species that have been recovered entirely in the wild. Then later on we go through to somewhere that there's been captive breeding, or with plants they've been grown in nurseries and put out in new sites in the wild. There's always a wild connection. We've got 2 chapters where they've been putting up large fences to keep out predators, and we've got an entire chapter about the role of captive breeding in threatened species recovery.
Yeah, wonderful. Wow.
So we don't try and limit what might be considered as recovery. We take a full range of definitions of that term, and explore those, and people can make up their own minds.
Right. And I understand that throughout the review, you kind of, as you mentioned as well in the end of the book there, you're kind of drawing all of these cases together and kind of finding some correlating factors. Is that kind of how these the, I guess, success factors were generally brought about?
That's right, because we want these successes replicated in lots of other species. And someone was asking me the other day about, what's are you going to put in volume 2, which was quite fun. We had to exclude a number because we're getting too many birds in there, which happens to be my speciality. But there are plenty of others we could have put in there, but we wanted to get the breadth of experience across the country.
Yeah, right. I obviously can't wait to get my hands on it. But from the small amount of notes that I read, the amazing successes that have happened for a number of species are really quite stunning. Like the turnaround on Macquarie Island just by controlling invasive species for basically the entire ecosystem starting to kind of recover.
That's right. But you say just get rid of a few invasive species, but my goodness, that was an extraordinary logistic achievement.
Absolutely.
And even political achievement to get the funds for it. And then the first year the weather came in, so they couldn't complete it. They had to go back the next year. They had to 5 years. They had people walking all over the island, making sure they really had got rid of the rabbits and the rats and the mice and the cats. So it was just an amazing story of dedication by people to bring that success about.
And really requires, from what I understand, for a lot of these projects, community support is one of the really major factors for the success of these recovery projects.
Indeed. You've got to have the community behind you, and the community can contribute so much to these sorts of projects. You mentioned I worked on glossy black cockatoos on Kangaroo Island, and we could never have done that without the support of the community in not just monitoring the birds, but we trained people to climb trees and see how the nestlings were going, to protect trees from possums, to chase out the bees from nest hollows, and all sorts of things.
Wow, like community members on Kangaroo Island? That's
right, yes.
Oh, wow.
I went there as a researcher and was terrified about climbing trees, so I thought, if I do it with a group, we'll all do it together, and they're terrific, and it meant we had the farmers involved, and lots of people.
Hey, if they've grown up on the island climbing the trees there themselves, then they'll be the best ones to teach you how to do it.
And people were very proud of their birds there and having them nesting on their property and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I can imagine. Look, for anybody who hasn't seen the glossy black cockatoo, just imagine if you've seen a sulphur-crested cockatoo, make that black and give them some beautiful yellow kind of sulphury patching around their lower face and neck. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the females, and then they have these wonderful red panels in the tail, and the most endearing personalities. They're very tend to be tame in the wild. You can get very close to them, and they just go on eating their casuarinas and looking at you.
Yeah, right. So, well, look, it's not surprising that people are, there's so much community support for these animals as well, particularly in such an amazing area like Kangaroo Island with some, pretty unique species in the area.
But it's not just those charismatic species. That's one of the things that came through in the book. It's just about anything. If it's near extinction, people will become attached to it. Two of the plants we've got in here have spiny in their name. There's a spiny daisy and a spiny rice flower. And both of them have really strong community support.
Hey, there's a lot of us who are fans of spiny, prickly organisms and people.
Yes, but if it's rare, then people feel that they're the underdog, they're the battlers, they've got to look after them. And survey after survey is saying that people do not want further extinctions.
Absolutely. And that's obviously coming through with the amount of, push for, threatened species conservation in Australia and abroad as well. But, it's the amount of community support, the amount of importance that community seems to have for these successes is huge. I understand as well from Indigenous communities for a lot of these projects, which is awesome to see Indigenous and scientific knowledge streams kind of combining really intricately to come up with solutions for threatened species. It's quite fascinating.
Yes, there's one chapter we have in here about the Waru in the APY lands in northern South Australia, where the Indigenous community has been absolutely critical. It is they are their animals, and they have elected to put a lot of effort into conserving them, and that is happening around the country, where there are lots of ranger groups now who are taking responsibility for the threatened species on the land on which they're working.
Right.
And there's a lovely example it's not included in this book, hopefully it will be in the next one, up on Cape York, where the Ulkala people, for them the golden-shouldered parrot is Alwal, they call it, is a significant bird culturally, and at this very moment they are developing the first Indigenous-led recovery plan for the species.
Oh, fantastic.
So, yes, there's a lot of exciting developments in that space, and you can see that threatened species management can become one of a set of sort of economic opportunities people being paid to look after them should they choose to do so.
Well, right, and it also provides even more reason for that community support. Like if you're providing, potential for employment and not just that, but that connection to country that comes with, I guess, being around nature and maybe even helping threatened species conservation projects or environmental conservation projects, whatever they may be, may fulfill some of that, connection to country.
Well, it gives people an opportunity in many cases to get back onto country or to live on country and fulfill cultural responsibilities because they're resourced to do the work on threatened species. And then you do get this overlap where the threatened species itself is culturally highly important.
Yeah, fantastic. And as you mentioned, the first Indigenous recovery plans are being developed. That's fantastic, incredible news. But can you tell us a bit about the importance of recovery plans now that there's there seems to be a bit of a struggle to get them up off the ground some of the time?
Yes, well, recovery plans we found was a common feature. There's been some concern of lots of plans being written and nothing being done. But where there has been success, recovery plans have really featured as one of the factors that has driven that success. People think through the major threats, what the impacts are, what knowledge is needed, what actions are then required. They do it in a systematic way, and they do it in a way that's adaptive, so they have a plan, see what works, and then adjust that plan. So unless you do that planning, then recovery is much less likely. You would rush off and do things that won't work or even cause harm unless it's done systematically.
Right, and obviously, systematically you're getting a better, hopefully a more efficient outcome, but also, you can potentially monitor them better, and, I guess that's where the importance of the adaptability of the plan comes into it. If you can monitor it well and it's nice and adaptable, then you can hopefully foresee any changes or threats.
That's right, and planning that monitoring, because you can rush off and monitor the wrong thing that doesn't tell you anything. And so planning the monitoring with help from statisticians so that you can actually detect trends when they occur is an essential element of a recovery plan and a part of the recovery process.
Yeah, good experimental design so you actually get good statistical outcomes is always a challenge.
That's right, and we're getting better at it, at knowing not to collect too much information, collect the right amount. You need enough to know what's happening, but don't put all your effort into monitoring. You should make sure you've got enough to manage threats as well.
Now, you mentioned that recovery plans obviously are one of those key sort of steps in the recovery process. From what I understand, there's 7 steps that throughout the review were identified as being important for recovery. Do you mind taking us through those 7 just briefly?
Certainly. The recovery plan is the first one, but you've got to, in combination with that, is to have a team of people who will put that plan into effect. And that was, we found that was a common feature across almost all of these success stories. So the recovery team should involve a wide range of stakeholders with an interest in that process. So we've got there's a cockatoo in southwest Australia which was eating apples and things like that. Now the apple growers were not part of the initial recovery team, and so it wasn't making much headway because they were able to they had their concerns, quite legitimate, and they needed to be brought in to the recovery team to have an effect. And so it is really important to get everybody, those who are affected, could be affected negatively by the recovery process, as well as those who desperately want the species to recover.
Right. It's important to recognize the impacts of the recovery process, not just on the threatened species itself.
That's right. And now increasingly, as we talked about, Indigenous traditional owners are becoming part of recovery teams. It's a good thing to have certainly the key government departments, but also groups outside government departments with an interest in a species. So NGOs have played very important roles on many, or just individuals with an interest.
Right. Okay. So that's getting the right team together. What's next on the steps to recovery?
So within a recovery team, you often have someone who will dedicate their life to bringing something back. The champion of the species.
And it doesn't take long working with wildlife to start meeting some people who are very, very, lifelong dedicated to a certain animal or cause or something like that.
That's right. So the best teams, you have a champion, you have your team there, and the champion and the team work together to bring the species back. And they go to extraordinary lengths. It's not something that's a job in most cases. It's a vocation.
It's a bit of a calling.
Yes, and we're odd species in that sense, is that there are people who will dedicate their lives to retaining other species. There's no other species does that. And those of us who don't want extinctions have an enormous debt to these people. So they're giving so much of their life. So, many of the chapters are written by people who have had that role in the recovery process.
Right, so there'll be a lot of recovery champions who are also champion authors in this in this book as well.
Exactly.
Wonderful. All right, and so after we have our champions, what's our next step?
So you need to have the legislation and policy in place. It's very difficult if you have things working against protection of a species in terms of allowing developments to go ahead, not providing the sort of the policy people in government who will say, look, there's the species over there, that shouldn't be cleared, there shouldn't be development there, and we have had the EPBC Act since 2000, and it has certainly fulfilled some roles where it is important to get species onto the EPBC lists to ensure they're protected. We've got a number of projects where we're trying to bring things onto the list that are missed out and so don't get considered when developments go ahead.
Just for our audience, it says the Environment and Biodiversity Protection EPBC Act. Yeah. Right. Protection and Conservation Act.
That's right. That's what it is. So,
Environment and Biodiversity Protection and Conservation Act, EPBC Act.
So that's been an important instrument for protecting species. But not only you need the legislation, you need policy to make sure that Act is complied with, and where possible, you need policy to go beyond the Act. For there to be active support for threatened species conservation, not just protection from threats coming from outside or coming from development.
Obviously, when you're monitoring things and if things take a turn and things need to change, then things need to be a little bit adaptive as much as possible, and that's a bit difficult in policy some of the time.
That's right, and that's a federal act, and so it has some functions under federal powers, but there's lots of things the states and territories have jurisdiction over, and it's one of the things has been support from within the states and territories, or even local government, to support threatened species as well. Right.
Okay. So obviously, continued work on policy and law as more information and research and new threatened species projects come to light. Where do we go from there?
So resources, money, well, not just money, but certainly it's a lot of threatened species work tends to be funded with short-term projects, sort of a couple of years, maybe a few years longer. It's taken a long time for many of these threatened species to become threatened, and it's going to take a long time to bring them back. And it needs sustained funding. Because if the funding falters, then you go back again, and it has to start again. So there needs to be, and a common feature of these success stories is sustained funding. These recovery teams and the recovery champions are often very effective at drawing on multiple sources to gain the support. You'll have a government program last for a few years, then you have to jump to another one, write the proposals the right ways. There's not often that you get a government that will say, here's 20 years support to bring this species back. That would be ideal. But these success stories, a common feature is being able to keep the flow of money coming, and it's not just money, it's other resources as well, particularly skills, having adequate skills in the people who are involved, and making sure those are maintained. So yes, you've got to have adequate support and as much as possible continuous support for extended periods and until they're at a stage where they can survive with little or no outside input.
Yeah, I guess committing to providing those resources until they are recovered, or at least somewhat stabilized. Bit of a challenge.
That's right. And then the next step is the role of research. Every one of these, there's been enough knowledge at the start or generated through the project to make the interventions effective. Because without that, as I mentioned, you can spend a lot of time doing things that don't actually do very much for the species concerned. So all of these are based on good research on the natural history of the species, the constraints on its survival, the threats that are affecting them, and how to manage those threats.
Right, so really getting the research done so you can address those like life history weak spots, I guess, wherever there is more risk for that species or that group or whatever it is, really finding out what those risks and threats are, I guess. Is that correct?
That's correct, and being willing to adjust the management in the light of new knowledge, so that you can't have a rigid plan, and you need to have adaptive management with research going hand in hand with the implementation of management, and monitoring goes along there too. And of course, they're often not one-off research. What you learn about one species, you can apply to other species, so that we get incremental improvement across the board because of work done on one species, improving the management of other ones.
Right. So obviously, yeah, what might work for one might work for others, but even the research that shows that what one works for one doesn't work for another is also very important.
That's certainly correct.
To avoid those to avoid those bad decisions, of course. Yeah.
You mentioned Macquarie Island earlier. Macquarie Island built on work that had been done in New Zealand, where they're getting larger and larger islands from which they're able to eradicate rats and mice and rabbits and things like that. Now, Macquarie was the biggest island attempted in the world at that time, but it would not have been possible had the techniques not been developed in New Zealand. And now they're thinking of removing rats from Lord Howe Island. They're doing lots of rat eradications and cat eradications in Western Australia that will then make islands safe from those sorts of predators. And some of these stories talk about that learning process. Arid Recovery has a chapter on what they learnt when you put up huge fences in arid Australia and put vulnerable small mammals in there to keep them away from cats and foxes. And some of them did so well they got too many of them.
Yeah, right.
had to take some out. And you've got to, so it's this adaptive management that's a key part of any successful recovery.
Yeah, right. That's fascinating. That some of those management strategies for Macquarie came from New Zealand. I know that they had their issues with bird loss on islands. I think was it on the lighthouse keeper who found the last of the little shrew type wrens. Was that on New Zealand?
Yes, it was a little wren, but it was in the mouth of its cat and already dead, the Stephen Islands wren. And but they've lost so much from New Zealand, but they've been willing to try all sorts of things to bring things back, and are now exporting that knowledge around the world.
Yeah, good on them.
Yes, and it's actually good for New Zealand's economy that they have been so innovative in their management of threatened species.
All right, fantastic. So we've got our recovery plan, we've got our team, we've got our champions, we've got our policy and law, we've got our resources, we've got our evidence and adapting to new evidence as it emerges. Final step in the recovery process
is telling the story, which is what this book is about, but also in lots of other media. People have to know that there has been success. You tell the story of the species and its struggles to start with. Quite a few of them, as we talked about, were rediscoveries. They thought they'd been lost, and then someone had the right knowledge and was in the right place at the right time and came across this last remaining bird or plant or other
small
animal.
Lizard.
Yeah, small lizard, your pygmy blue tom, the stick insect on Ball's pyramid, and it makes a wonderful story. And people support that and recognise the importance, the uniqueness of the story of that particular threatened species, and identify with that. And you can tell every species has a story of some sort that can be told, and that's critical to getting all the other factors in place, is telling that story, and then when the good news happens, telling that story, but also continuing to tell the story of the struggle, just making sure the community is aware of the effort being put in to recover species.
Right, absolutely. No, it is very important. Like as we mentioned, it can be a very tough field to be in, but the successes that I guess we're seeing more and more often are quite amazing, and do give a lot of hope for people with an eye on environment and ecosystem and threatened species at the moment.
Indeed, and we've got yes, there's still a lot of problems out there, but they're not insuperable, and just about anything can be brought back and retained if we put the effort in, and the public is behind us, and there's the investment, and the money put in to keep the work going.
Yeah, right. Well, what I find really interesting about all this is that you've got this book about threatened species recovery and dealing with fauna and environment and ecosystems, and in the end, it's really about people. You've got this emphasis on communities and whether that's the Indigenous or the scientific community or the local community or these other community groups or even other public or governmental or business organizations. You've certain people with very important skills for finding these resources or changing policy and law, your recovery champions, getting the teams together. It's incredible. In the end, it really is about the people in the community that are involved, which is not surprising.
That's right. In some ways, the biology is the easy part. It's the social side that's the trickier part of threatened species recovery, and of course it's a social value to say that threatened species are important. That's from the very start. It's about the people, and we think as a society that threatened species ought not to be lost, and we express that through our legislation. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, no one did think that was important. Now they do. And now we think it's an important element of having a civilized society, is to make sure we retain the biodiversity heritage that we inherited and pass it on to our children.
Could not agree with you more. So, where to from here? How do you, well, obviously the book's coming out, you're going to be spreading these fantastic success stories. How do you guys at TSR Hub plan to implement this stuff more broadly? And I guess more importantly, where do you start to look for future recovery champions and people for the projects and all the work in threatened species recovery?
Well, there are a lot of people out there. As I mentioned, there's many other stories we could tell. I've just been involved with a couple of workshops with one on birds, one on fish, one on the Christmas Island frigate bird. To each of them, we were able to invite substantial numbers of people with expertise in those areas who are the incipient or existing species champions. Our job is to work out how we can get them support, link them together, get a a network of people who can support each other, identify the skills, identify how we deal with the threats. Our research is built partly about how we alleviate the threats, but there's a big social science element in there as well. There's some on economics and how important threatened species can be to some communities in terms of the economic value. There are many different avenues for trying to rescue these species, keep support going for them, turn them around so that in the end we have fewer threatened species. We just have lots of valuable ones, but they're not likely to go extinct.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, a lot of work in the future, and look forward to seeing everything that you guys are doing. Professor Stephen Garnett, thank you so much for joining us. This has been super, super interesting. I've had a great time, and I can't wait to talk to you guys more about this fantastic book.
We'll talk to you again around Volume 2, whenever that might be.
Wonderful. Excellent. And people can obviously pick up the book from CSIRO Publishing. I think you can go there online at publish.csiro.au. And you can also check out Professor Stephen Garnett at cdu.edu.au for the Charles Darwin University. Many thanks as well to Jana Dielenberg, Science and Communication Manager for TSR Hub, for setting all this up. You can check out TSR Hub, that's TSR_Hub on Twitter, or at NESP Threatened Species on Facebook. Right, I think that's about it. Thanks again, Stephen. Can't wait to talk to you again for Volume 2 whenever it comes out.
Thanks a lot.
No worries, mate. You have a good day. Cheers. All right, guys. That's been Professor Stephen Garnett. I'm your host, Yanni Tokola. Plenty more wildlife cake and cocktails coming up soon. Cheers. Talk soon. Bye.